Hello, and welcome to a video where I talk about the books that I do like instead of the ones that I don't, for a change. Throughout the years I've seen many a video where people have talked about their favourite books of all time, and I thought that finally I would do the same, because I would like to see how my taste changes over the next few years, and whether I stand by the books that are on this list, or whether I think, what on earth was I thinking? So let's get started. First, I think we should talk about the only book on this list that I do not own a physical copy of. We really need to change that at some point. That book is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Now, I grew up on the Michael Caine Muppets Christmas Carol film, but my spur to pick this book up came because I had to study it for school. And I think when you pick apart a book and you still love it, I think that's a sign of a really, really good book. If you don't know, Christmas Carol is about an old miser named Scrooge who is the complete antithesis of generous. He's not very nice, he's not very kind, he does not give to the poor. In fact, he thinks that it's their fault that they are poor. But on the night of Christmas Eve, leading into the early hours of Christmas Day, he's visited by three spirits that aim to try and change his behaviour. Otherwise, he will end up in a very bad situation, which I will not elaborate on too much because this book is only a novella, and surprisingly, the Muppets adaptation is actually quite faithful to the book. Who would have thought? Next, let's move into some of my favourite series, starting with the Lockwood & Co series by Jonathan Stroud. Now, I still haven't seen the Netflix adaptation, probably because I'm worried that it might distort some of the views I had of the characters and make me imagine them in a way that is different to how I did originally, and I don't like it when series do that, and I feel like they do that quite a lot for me, which is why I haven't watched it. Also, how faithful is it to the book? That's something else that annoys me about adaptations. Before I get into a whole rant, let me just tell you what it's about. So we're following an alternate Britain where there are a lot of ghosts around causing havoc, and we are following three teenagers that essentially have an organisation to get rid of the ghosts. I think the character dynamics are a huge pull for this book because they are done very well, and also the quality remains very high throughout the whole series. The plots are all really good. Like every series, there are always going to be better books than others, but I think it takes quite a lot of skill to keep all of the books at a high quality. I really need to reread this series because it's been quite a while. Next, we have what I would consider as a criminally underrated series, and that is the Sinclair's Mysteries and then Taylor and Rose Secret Agents by Katherine Woodfine. And in this, we are following our two main characters, Sophie and Lil, at this department store in Edwardian London. And while they both start working at this department store, they then get wrapped up in this mystery that then leads to a 4-book series, and then later on when they're a bit older, they become secret agents, and then that leads to another 4-book series. So it's a grand old time if you like this sort of thing. I think Katherine Woodfine has done a great job of getting a great panorama of Edwardian London, because she covers like the debutantes, but then she also covers the East End at the time, and I think that the plots are also really interesting. It's not like a murder mystery, it's like a sort of Mission Impossible mystery. That's probably the best way I can describe it, because I'm thinking about spy films at the moment. I don't know why. Reading this series was so fun, and I was kind of like an OG reader of this because I was reading it as the books were coming out, and that was a really fun time. I remember like sitting on the bus looking at the end and thinking, when's the next book coming out? Unfortunately, they're all out, so I can't do that any longer. Probably the most modern out of all of these books, although technically speaking they're all at least in the 2010s, is Amari and the Night Brothers by Alston. I absolutely would have loved this book had it come out when I was 11 years old, because it's like if Percy Jackson was a spy series, because we're following Amari and her brother has gone missing under mysterious circumstances, and eventually she goes into his room and discovers the suitcase, which then leads her to discovering Bureau of Supernatural Affairs. And she goes there and she discovers that her brother was actually an agent, and something strange has obviously gone down. I think the best draw for this book series is the world that Alston has created here. It is so rich and expansive, and I'm really annoyed that this is only scheduled to be a trilogy, because I think there are so many avenues that he could take his his ideas down. I'm also happy that the second book in this series did not fall into that second book syndrome. Of course, it's setting up the last book, but it felt like a story in its own right, and it continues the plot threads of this so wonderfully. And I really just could not recommend it enough. I would even recommend it above the other kind of like popular middle grade fantasy series of this type. I think it's a lot more diverse in terms of representation. And I think for a middle grade age, I think that's really good. So I would highly recommend. Next, we have Lonely Castle in the Mirror by Mizuki Tsujimura. And this is a kind of loose, cozy fantasy following this girl that has been out of school for quite a while. She's been bullied, and one day she discovers that her mirror is glowing, and she manages to go through her mirror, and behind said mirror she discovers this whole magical castle. And in the castle as well, there are some kind of like-minded individuals that she befriends. There's a kind of like contest element to this book, because if they can find this secret room, then one of them will receive a wish. But I don't want anyone getting twisted that this is a book that is high on plot, because it's not. It's very slow. It's very much about character interactions, but also there's quite good commentary on the Japanese school system, which I think can be applied to over here in Britain as well. I felt very seen by this book in the way that it portrayed friendship, because I'm not someone that has managed to stray away from friendship struggles, and I think it was great at covering those themes, because yes, I would say it is kind of cozy fantasy, but I think it deals with some more serious topics. I think it's great for someone that just wants to get into fantasy and like sort of like character-based stories. I think you would really get on with this. There are also some twists at the end that I think really wrap everything up. I think this was so well executed, and I'm so glad I loved it. Next, I think we should delve into graphic novel territory. I'm going to mention the Heartstopper series because it's like right down here, and I don't really want to take away all of my graphic novels just to find it. So Heartstopper is kind of a rogue one for me, because as someone who does not like romance, surely you would be surprised that I like this series. I think because it's more than just a romance, because obviously we are following a romance, but we're also following their lives. We're following their struggles. We're following their school lives. There's also a great friendship group, and I love friendship stories. It's also very British, and I can relate to the Britishness of it as someone who's British. There are also a lot of interesting discussions in this series, but at no point did it really feel preachy, and I think that takes quite a lot of skill to be able to do that. Next, we have Nimona by N.D. Stevenson, and I believe this kind of falls into like the morally grey side of things that I eat up. I love when an author isn't afraid to make characters unlikable, to get them to make bad choices, because I am quite tired of when the main character in books is perfect and always makes the right choice. In reality, people don't always do the right thing, and so I like literature that explores that. And I think this is more on the side of accidental villain rather than villain, because this one is about a girl named Nimona who's kind of been a bit rejected and ostracized by society, and she ends up working at the kingdom's resident villain. His name's Ballister Blackheart. They end up kind of working together, trying to avoid capture by law enforcement. But the reader also finds themselves asking, are they really evil, or are they just kind of scapegoats by the government? One of the best things is the characters come alive on page, and I think that is quite hard to do when your only way of telling the story is through images and dialogue. My favourite book of 2022 was Babel by R.F. Kuang, and this one deals heavily with language and colonialism, because we are following Robin, who is orphaned in Canton, and he is brought to Britain to study languages, and he ends up at Oxford University, which is kind of the centre of the British Empire in this alternate history. I hear most people pitch this as fantasy, and I would say that it is mostly historical, but there are some light fantasy elements to it. I wouldn't expect a lot of plot. There are some dramatic things that happen, but it's not what I think some people expect, because it fits under the umbrella of dark academia, but it's not a dark academia that is very action-packed. It's a lot slower, and I think if you don't like books that feel a little bit textbooky at times, especially if you don't like languages, I wouldn't pick this up. but I like all that sort of thing, so I loved it. Another part of my taste is weird experimental books, and this one imagines death as a real person, and it's about her kind of telling her story. I like books that muse on existence and death and the meaning of life, and personally I found this to be a very interesting read. I know it hasn't been for everyone, but it very much was for me, and I would appreciate recommendations along this type because it was a in the back of the net for me. I can't remember the phrase. My brain is mashed potatoes. Another classic, and that is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. It's another one that has very morally grey characters that gets quite dark. I like books that aren't afraid to go there, and this really goes there. The ending is perfect, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, but it was perfect. It did things that I did not expect. I remember reading this in the car, and my jaw was kind of going like, I definitely had a good variety of expressions while I was reading this book. Anyway, it is about this guy called Dorian who gets this portrait done of him, and instead of him aging, the portrait ages. We also follow his story through the lens of various different other characters that all like to voice their views on various different topics. If that sounds a little bit simple and boring to you, it is not. It gets a little bit nuts, and I kind of ate it up. No kind of about it, I ate it up. I ate and I left no crumbs because this book was so good. And I'm glad I spent more money on this lovely edition because it was worth it. Another example of me actually knowing my reading taste. Next we have The Spirit Bears Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White, and this may be recency bias because it was one of my favourite books of last year and is probably my most recent 5-star read in fact, but it was really, really good, and the longer I've been away from this book, the more it has cemented how well I think that Andrew Joseph White did with the themes in this book. It is about our main character Silas, who wants to be a surgeon, and we are following again an alternate history. This time we are set in the Victorian era, which I love a good book set in the Victorian / Edwardian era. I don't know what it is about that era, but if you give me a book set in that time, I will probably thank you, unless it's terrible. Anyway, the alternate history in this book involves people being able to communicate with spirits. The spirit veil has fallen down, and it's all very sort of atmospheric and gothic. Now, Silas, our main character, is believed to be suffering from a veil sickness that turns his eyes purple, and he is sent to this boarding school / sanatorium to kind of cure him and make him into what society wants, essentially. There are some really, really strong themes in this book, particularly how Victorian society was so set upon ostracizing people that did not fit into the mold, and there are some great metaphors in this book to do with it. It's a YA book, and although the characters are definitely teenagers, it did not feel whiny or some of the other negative press that I hear a lot of YA books get. It also had me on edge, both from the horror elements, but also the horror of society. I don't read a lot of young adult contemporary these days. I feel like that ship has sailed. I'm no longer 14 years old with a lot of free time and very few friends. This is another one that falls under the categorization of friendship stories. It's another one by Alice Oseman, only this time we are not following a romance. We are following what is pretty much entirely a friendship between two characters. And in this we are following Frances, who is very, very academic, but she's also obsessed with this podcast called University, which she finds out is actually created by the brother of one of her, shall we say, best friends from her childhood. I found this book to be very relatable. I'd say Frances and I are probably quite similar people. I think it has some good discussions about the school system. I think it could have gone further, but I think that what it does say is quite meaningful, because schools these days have an annoying habit of trying to push people to go to university, and they don't really tell you about the alternatives. They say that there are alternatives, but they don't really explore them properly, and then that leads to people having a distorted view about what they actually want. And I think this book did quite a good job at betraying that. Another one with a relatable character that I feel like I probably shouldn't have related to is Sally Rooney's Conversations with Friends. Now, I feel like she's quite a kind of controversial author. I feel like you either get her or you don't get her. It's a bit like Marmite, I suppose. But in this book, I got her because after I finished reading it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I think at a very surface level, that is what makes a book 5 stars for me. I need to think about it. It needs to have interesting points. In this, we are following a 21-year-old student, also called Frances. Interestingly, both relatable characters, both called Frances. That is quite curious. And she kind of falls into a relationship with this married man, but it's not really about that. It's kind of about her, and I read it in a point of my life where I could really relate to her sort of apathy towards life. She doesn't really care what she does, and that is kind of under the lens of like she's a bit of a trust fund baby, but at the same time I could really relate. Another part of the reason I like this so much is because there's quite a lot of drama and I kind of just eat up drama. There's a few philosophical discussions in this book that I think were handled well and were interesting, so that's another point for it. How many other ways can I express that I enjoyed this book? I'm not sure. I'm gonna move on to the next one, which is kind of like an absurdist, magical realism, loose fantasy book. I love things like this. I really do. I love Erin Morgenstern, and I want more books like Erin Morgenstern. This is The Night Circus, and I think by the title you can kind of tell what it is about, because it is about a travelling circus that kind of appears, but then it goes, and it's all very magical and strange. We are once again following a Victorian/Edwardian setting, because this is set probably from around 1890 to around 1902. I would say it's set over at least 10 years, and we are following all of the various different characters that have something to do with this circus. There's also whispers of this magical competition, which I think is the reason why a lot of people don't like this book, because the way that the synopsis paints it makes you think that there's going to be more plot than there actually is. No. It's just whimsical, incredible writing. Yeah. Once again, I want to reread this at some point because this book is the definition of magical. I loved it. It was so good. So good. And finally, Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison, rumfitt, which was my favourite book of 2023. Another thing I really like in books is a social commentary, and this book, yes, we love social commentary. Anyway, it is about 2 characters that went into a haunted house, and some sort of traumatic event went down in said haunted house. And when they come out, they don't have anything to do with each other for a very long time. A lot of this book is kind of an allegory for like fascism and for radicalization. I found that both of Alison Rumfitt's books are actually very topical to the society now, and while that definitely does not speak to everyone, it certainly spoke to me because I like books that comment on society, evidently, and this book did just that. That, though, I believe, is the end of this video. I've talked for like half an hour, so I feel like I better stop. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and like, please give me recommendations of books that are sort of along this line. I don't mean carbon copies, I just mean that take some of these elements and put them into something new. That's what I want. If anyone wants to read my favourite books, this is your sign. But otherwise, I hope you have enjoyed, and I will leave you to get on with the rest of your day. Goodbye.